Joshua chapter 10. We're going to be in Joshua chapter 11 if you'll get there with me in the Bible. Joshua chapter 11. But in Joshua chapter 10, we saw the armies of Israel defeat the southern coalition of nations. Remember, Israel came in right in the middle. The people of Israel came into the land of Canaan in the center of the land. God split the land of Canaan into south and north when he took Jericho and Ai and Bethel. And then in Joshua 10, Joshua turned his attention to the southern parts of Israel. In Joshua chapter 11, what we're going to see is Joshua turns his attention to the northern parts of Israel. We're going to see the end of the conquest. It's a very few short chapters in the book. It covers about a 7-year period, Joshua chapter 1 to chapter 12. A 7-year period is what we've gone over. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. So Yahweh, as we saw in chapter 10, got directly involved in the fighting. Remember what he did? There was this great coalition, an army of 5 different armies that had come together, and God had to get involved directly. The swords of Joshua killed very, very many men, but the hailstones that God threw down from heaven killed even more men than Joshua's army's swords. That's what Joshua chapter 10 speaks of. We, as Christians, we read the Bible all the time and we say that the battle is the Lord's. David, when he fought Goliath, this uncircumcised Philistine, said the battle is the Lord's. God fights the battle for Israel. God fights our battles for us. And we say that over and over. In Joshua chapter 10, we actually see it. We see God actively fight a battle for Israel, that without God's direct help with these hailstones, Israel wouldn't have been able to defeat this huge army. What we're going to see in chapter 11 is an even greater army, an even larger number of people. According to Josephus in the book of chapter 11, we're going to possibly see an army of 300,000 people come against the people of Israel. Large armies with many, many horses, many, many chariots. Israel doesn't have either one of those, horses or chariots. But I get ahead of myself. There were pockets, listen to this statement, there were pockets here and there that Israel did not kill. Remember what Yahweh told Israel to do, what God commanded Moses, what Moses commanded Joshua? Go into the land of Canaan and kill everything that breathes. Cleanse the land of all idolatry and all idolaters. I'm going to start in the land of Canaan with my children Israel pure. But as we see from the Scripture, look at these verses. I say that just so you can keep in the back of your head when you hear things like, and Joshua defeated all the land and all the nations were subdued and all the peoples came under the... No, that's not the truth. That's not what those verses mean. There are people, and we'll talk about that later when we get to them. But there are people in the land of Canaan that Israel simply didn't cleanse the land of. They allowed them to stay in the land. In Joshua chapter 13, we'll see, but the sons of Israel did not dispossess the Geshurites or the Maccathites, for Geshur and Maacath live among Israel until this day. What were they supposed to do to those people? As harsh as it sounds, and I'm not trying to sound harsh, I'm trying to be biblically accurate, what were they supposed to do to those people? Kill everything that breathes. Look what we see in Joshua chapter 15:63. Now as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah could not drive them out. What should they have done? Driven them out of all places, Jerusalem. But they didn't. And so the Jebusites live with the sons of Judah at Jerusalem until this day. All these people were to be utterly destroyed, but Israel didn't kill them. They allowed idolaters and idolatry to remain in the land, and they eventually were crushed by it. Israel couldn't stand up to the idolatry. They fell to the idolatry because a bad apple ruins the whole bunch. And the apple of idolatry, the bad apple of idolatry and idolaters, brought Israel down into idolatry. And God knew it. God told him that. God told him that. They did not drive out the Canaanites who live in Gezer, so the Canaanites live in the midst of Ephraim to this day, and they became forced laborers. So it's true that the Canaanites that remained in the land did become forced laborers, but not forever. They rose up, they reorganized. They became the Philistines, and the Philistines were a thorn under Israel's saddle for another few centuries after this. Remember who Goliath was? What was Goliath? The giant. He was a Philistine. If Israel under Joshua would have gone out and done what God told them to do and destroyed everything that breathed, we wouldn't have the story of David and Goliath. Goliath's people would have been wiped from the planet. What did God warn them? Through Moses in Numbers chapter 33. I mean, what's the bad thing about not driving out all these people? What's the big deal? We let a few live. God warned them, if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about, may take a little while, but it will come about. This is a promise. It shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become as pricks in your eyes and as thorns in your sides, and they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you. This was a critical step that Joshua and his army, and not only Joshua, but all the people of Israel, failed at. They left idolaters and they left idolatry in the land. And it would be their downfall. Now in Joshua chapter 11, Joshua turns his attention, as I said, to the northern territories of the land of Canaan. Just a little quick outline here. The second half of an outline I've given you before. In verses 1 through 15, we see the northern campaign. This is the military action. This is the fighting. Only 15 verses. Hundreds of thousands of people in the northern land of Canaan are subdued, and God takes 15 verses to tell us about it. Hundreds of thousands of people are killed, and God takes 15 verses to tell us about it. In this chapter, in verse 16, begins a review of the victories. And Joshua marched here and defeated all the people and left no one alive, left no captives there, no survivors. And then it'll go on to the next city. Then he moved on here. He moved on here. He destroyed this king and this king. And I think the number is 31 kings that these chapters cover that say Joshua and his armies defeated 31 kings. Let me say one more thing about this, just so as we go through the story you'll understand. When we get to the end of this and it says Joshua defeated all these people, the armies of Israel defeated all these people, left nothing alive that breathed. Understand that we're not talking about 100% of the people in the land of Canaan. I just showed you verses that showed there were people in the land of Canaan that were left alive. What we're talking about when we get to that, just so you can start to understand this, is when Joshua led a united Israeli army force. When they were one force fighting as one army, they defeated the major cities of the southern part of the land of Canaan and the northern part of the land of Canaan. All the major cities were destroyed by Joshua and his army. After that, we're going to see the tribes, Judah, Ephraim, Manasseh, Dan. All these tribes start to get their own territory. And within their own territory, they were responsible for going in there and continuing the sweeping out of the Canaanite people. Remember, there was a man named Caleb, that in the book of Joshua, Caleb was given this hill called Hebron in this area. All the giants weren't gone from there. In the book of Joshua chapter 11, when it says, and Joshua conquered and defeated all the people, what it means is all the major cities that Joshua, as he led this one united Israeli army, they defeated all the major cities. They broke the back of the resistance, if you will, making it possible for the smaller tribal armies to defeat everybody that was left. You get it? Joshua and his army did the heavy lifting. They destroyed the major cities, the major kings, and the major armies. There were plenty of skirmishes still left to be had when Joshua finishes his job of defeating the major cities and kings. These first 12 chapters cover 7 years. 7 years. And in those 7 years, chapters 1 through 9 probably only cover 1 year. Chapter 10 that we read last time, going to all these different cities, the 5 kings come around the one city of Gibeon. Joshua marches out, kills them. Then he goes to another city, Makkah. Then he goes to Eglon. Then he goes to all these different cities. That took time. We're talking about marching hundreds of thousands of soldiers over mountains. It took time to get there. So Joshua chapter 10 and Joshua chapter 11 probably cover about a 6-year period. He only covers it in 15 verses. The second half of this, the northern campaign, God gives 15 verses to it, but years, not a lot, but maybe 2 or 3 years go by in chapter 11. Keep that in mind as we read through it. It just doesn't happen like this, and Joshua's somehow transported to this new place to fight this battle. It takes a long time to get an army over mountains walking. The other thing that we'll see toward the end of the chapter, I'm just giving you the last 2 things. In chapters 13 to 21, we'll see the tribal territories. Each of the 12 tribes of Israel are going to start to get their own territory. In the land of Canaan, it's a territory that they should live in forever. And then at the end of the book, we'll see a conclusion in the last 2 chapters, 22 and 24. We're going to rush through these. We're not going to go through 13 to 21 chapter by chapter and see all the boundaries, all the cities, all the rivers and creeks and the brooks and all that. We're not interested in that. We have a pretty decent map of what the territories looked like. That's all that's important. The fact is, what chapters 13 to 21 show is that God owns the land and God gave it to Israel. And once Israel moved into the land, God divided it among the tribes of Israel. Not among the Arabs, not among the Muslims, not among anyone, not among a group that want to call themselves the Palestinians. God gave the land to Israel and He divided it among the 12 tribes of Israel, not to anyone else. This is Israel's land, eternal. They own the promised land because God gave it to them. So in these last chapters, we'll see a border dispute and then the last days of Joshua and the great Joshua saying, choose this day whom you will serve. Whether the kings of the Baal and the Asherah, whether the false gods of the land of Canaan, or whether the God of Israel, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, each of you choose whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. The greatness of Joshua. So, Joshua chapter 11 verse 1 says, Then it came about when Yabin, king of Hazor, now we've moved to the north. If you look at this map, here's the center line right here. Here's Jericho. Remember, that was the first battle they fought. So here's the center line. In Joshua chapter 10, he defeats the major cities and kings down here. In Joshua chapter 11, he moves to this part of the world up here. You see, way up here is Hazor. That's what we're talking about. This land up here is where this major battle is about to take place. So it says that Yabin, the king of Hazor, heard of it. What did he hear of? He heard that Joshua was winning in battle and utterly destroying people, killing kings, killing everybody in the land, killing men, women, children, herds, killing everything. That's what he's heard. He's also heard of this miraculous long day. Remember in Joshua chapter 10, we have this day when Joshua pleads with God, let this day be longer so I can defeat your enemies. And God holds the sun still in the sky. This king's heard about that they have a God that's stronger than the sun gods of Baal, stronger than the sun gods, of Canaan, stronger than the moon gods of Canaan. Their God, we know it, I've heard about it, their God made the sun stand still in the sky. I was there. I've got eyewitness accounts that have come and told me of this miraculous day. So this king in the north has heard about it. And so what does he say? He sent to Jobab, the king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshaph, and to the kings who were of the north. He's gathering a coalition of kings. All you have to know is that all these places are up here in this area. He's calling all these kings together so that they can destroy the army of Israel. So he's calling all the kings of the north. He's also calling the kings in the hill country, in the Arabah, south of Kinneret. Do you know what Kinneret is? It's the Sea of Galilee right here. The ancient name of the Sea of Galilee was Kinneret. And that's where they're at. That's where these people are. They're all up there in the north. He called them from the lowlands, from the heights of Dor on the west toward the sea, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite in the hill country. I mean, he's calling in everybody that hasn't been defeated. All the major cities, and their kings and all their major armies. This Yabin is bringing together a force bigger than any Israel has ever faced, except for 400 years ago when they faced the Egyptian army at the Red Sea. So he's amassing a massive army to crush Israel, to stop Joshua in his path. The Jebusite in the hill country, the Hivite at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mitzpeh. And so what happens when he calls them? They came out. Going out and coming in. When you read that in the Bible, the kings went out and they came in. When Solomon says, I'm a young man, I don't know how to go out and come in, he's talking about battle. I don't know how to lead an army in battle. So when it says that an army came out or a king came in, it's talking about leaving for battle and coming back for battle. And here in verse 4 it says, they came out. They prepared for battle, they armed for war, and they came out for war against Israel. They came out, they and all their armies with them. So the kings are leading the armies. As many people, look at how it numbers this army. As many people as the sand that is on the seashore. With very many horses and chariots. I told you earlier, there was a Jewish historian named Josephus, who lived about 100 AD. Now we're talking about after Jesus. But he was a Jewish historian, and he estimated that this army was about 300,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 cavalry troops, that's 10,000 horses, men on horseback. How does a man standing on the ground defeat an armed man on a horse? 10,000 cavalry troops and 20,000 chariots. Israel was completely outnumbered and completely outclassed as far as military strength went here. So in verse 5 it says, so all these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. And again, look at these maps and see what we see here. The waters of Merom are right here. Whenever you see a map of Israel, just as an aside, there are two seas, there are two bodies of water in Israel. One's at the south, the Dead Sea. One's at the north, the Sea of Galilee. So whenever you see a map, look for that body of water. It'll orient you whether you're in the north or the south. Here we see Kinneret. So this is Galilee. This is the same as this right here. So this is a map from here up. This white map is a map from here up. The other thing you can look for when you look at a map of Israel is this little hook. You see the hook right there. That's the opening to the Jezreel Valley, which is right here, where Mount Megiddo sits. And if Mount Megiddo sits there, what great battle is going to take place there? Armageddon. Har Megiddo. Armageddon means Mount Megiddo. The Hebrew word har, H-A-R, is mountain, and Megiddo sits right here. You see it, Megiddo. So this battle we call Armageddon when Jesus comes back is a battle fought at the feet of Mount Megiddo here in the Jezreel Valley. So this is where this is where these armies have gathered, and it's very intriguing to me that one of the first great battles in Israel were all the armies of the world united against Israel. Look what it says, to fight against Israel. Very interesting to me, is it not, that one day in the future, all the armies of the world will gather right here to fight Israel, and Jesus Christ will defeat them alone. Israel is ancient. When you go to Israel, not only do you see the beginnings of God-fearing civilization, but you see also the end of time and the Battle of Armageddon and the millennial kingdom, all taking place in this same little bitty postcard piece of land. I love that about it. What's interesting about the fact that all the armies of the earth are fighting against Israel is at least this simple fact right here. Haven't you guys heard? God said, I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. He was speaking to Abraham about his people Israel. Haven't you people heard? Why is it that you continue to try to beat the armies of God? Why is it that you continue to try to destroy Israel? Haven't you heard? It says when Yabin, the king of Hazor, heard of it, when he heard how the God of Israel was destroying people, what does he choose to do? Instead of falling down on his knees before the one true God, instead the nations rage, tries to bring an army together to defeat Israel. Still happening today, I guarantee, in the Middle East, in the heart of people like Vladimir Putin, and many others in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Syria. They are trying to devise a vain thing. They're trying to come against God and His people Israel. The end result of everything, all that little skirmishing that's going on over there, as devastating as it is in Ukraine, the end result is that Russia will stand one day with Turkey and Syria and march into Israel to destroy the Jews. We're living in momentous times. These aren't just little battles that aren't significant. These battles are end times triggers. The Bible teaches about these things. But it's interesting here that all these kings have gathered to fight against Israel. And what's God's response? We read it in Psalm chapter 2. Every time the kings of the earth gather to try to kill Israel, God says this: what are you people doing? Haven't you heard? I'll bless those who bless my people, and I'll curse those who curse her. And it'll never be different. So God says, why are the nations in an uproar the way they are here in Joshua chapter 11? These kings gathering their armies, their horses, their chariots. Why are you doing those things against the Lord's people? Why are the nations in an uproar, peoples devising vain things? The kings of the earth take their stand. Don't we see that in Joshua 11? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh. That's exactly what they're doing. They want to defeat Israel and Israel's God, Yahweh. They're happy with their gods, their false gods. This fight is against God. This fight is against Yahweh and His people Israel. And God says in Psalm 2, you take your counsel together against me and against my anointed. Here He's speaking of Jesus Christ. Anointed is the word Mashiach. It's the word we get Messiah from. So God is saying, why do the nations gather together to try to stop me from appointing Messiah? Why do they want to cast off my fetters and Messiah's fetters? Why do they want to cast our rulership cords off of them as if they're slaves and they're trying to rip off their chains? Why do you people still keep doing this? And what's God's response to it in the next verse? He who sits in the heavens laughs. When the nations rage and they say, if we could only come together, if we can only gather and amass an army big enough, we can defeat Israel and we can kill God's people. And God says, no, you can't. It's just as simple as that. He chuckles. No, you can't. I've promised you that you can't do this. I will curse the one who curses Israel. I will curse the one who curses my Messiah also. God tells us the end story here to these kings who are raging. Even in Joshua chapter 11, He will speak to them in His anger and terrify them in His fury. And He'll say, but as for me, while you nations and kings and rulers are trying to cast me off as the king of the universe, I have already established and decreed who the king will be. And He says, so while you are planning, I have already made my plan. I have already decreed it. It's already determined. It's set in a stone you couldn't touch. As for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. What's His king's name? Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah, the anointed one, Mashiach. And we see these people raging against God, and God says, why? So unnecessary. Bow down to me and worship me. I'll crush you. I promised you that I would crush you, and I keep my promises. You come against my people Israel, and by the morning you won't have breath in you anymore. That's what He promises. Why do we, as nations, continue to try to push God aside? God says that doesn't work. Yahweh responds, back to Joshua chapter 11, verse 6, the Lord said to Joshua, in the midst of understanding this massive army that's been arrayed against him, all these horses, all these chariots, what does Yahweh say? The same thing He says in Psalm 2. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be afraid of them. Do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You say, well, God, why would you do that? Because I told you I would do it. I promised to protect my people Israel. And you're going to see Him do it right here in Joshua chapter 11. I will deliver all of them slain before Israel, and you shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. That's what I think of their great army. More to come about that in just a minute. The hamstring of the horses and burning the chariots with fire. What does this show? That Yahweh is in complete control. It looks, again, like all is lost. There's no way that Joshua and his troops could defeat this army. It seems as if all is lost. They finally come up against a foe they can't destroy. And God says, don't you worry about a thing. Just like David and Goliath, a little bitty red-headed teenager being challenged by this the taunting of this uncircumcised Philistine, and you say that little boy has no chance. It'd be like Caleb trying to have a battle with Terry here. I got $20 on Terry, by the way. No chance in the world. And David says, I'm not worried about a thing because God is going to fight this battle. And that's exactly as Joshua is girding himself. Now understand what's going on here. It's a 5-day march from Gilgal to the north to the waters of Merom. It's a 5-day march. And God meets Joshua on the 4th day. God doesn't come to Joshua on the first day and say, Joshua, take the army up there. We're going to defeat them in battle. Joshua has been marching for 4 days to get up to where he is when God speaks to him, because we know to move an army of this size, it's a 5-day journey. And God says that in the morning, tomorrow, on the 5th day, I'm going to defeat this enemy from before you. So Joshua doesn't wait. He's been on the march. He's aggressive. This Joshua, he's aggressive in his command of the Israeli army. He doesn't wait defensively at Gilgal for this army to come down the Jordan River Valley and attack him where his women and his children are. He takes the battle to them. Very aggressive to this threatening army. He takes the battle to the enemy. He doesn't wait for them to bring the battle to him. He protects what's his. I love this. He's a protector of his women and his children. If I die in battle, so be it. But I'm not going to die on my home turf. I'll take the battle to them. We learn a lot about warfare from Joshua. So how does Joshua respond to Yahweh, who says, don't be afraid, in the morning I'm going to deliver all of them? So Joshua in verse 7, and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly. God has told me what I needed to hear. Let's go in. Against a 300,000 person army and all their horses and all their chariots, I say, charge. What a man of honor. What a man of valor. What a man. So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly. They attacked this army. Like David walked down the hill and presented himself to Goliath. David aggressively going out to Goliath, not sheepishly, not with fear. He had picked the 5 smooth stones from the river. He had his sling. He knew how to use it. And he knew somehow God is going to deliver Israel from this Philistine. And Joshua on this day knew somehow God is going to have us defeat that army. And all Joshua could say was, let's go do it. Charge. What a man. What a brave soul. So they came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. And the Lord delivered them because He keeps His promise. The Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel so that they defeated them and pursued them. So now the little David is chasing Goliath. The little army of Israel, however big it is now chasing this massive army. The army is fleeing before them. They pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Mishrepot-Mayim and the valley of Mizpeh to the east. Most of these places, we don't know where they are on a map anymore, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. Now, who fights in battle? Men, women, or children? In Joshua's day. Who fights in battle? Men. So you have to remember what I told you when we started. When it says Joshua left no survivor to them, we're talking about the military forces. There were more skirmishes in the towns that needed to take place to continue driving this people out. That doesn't mean making them leave. That means killing them. There was more to be done. In verse 9 it says, Joshua did to them as the Lord had told them. What did the Lord tell him? Hamstring all the horses and burn all the chariots. So Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and he burned their chariots with fire. Here's the Rick question. Why? Why? I'll offer 2 answers. The first of which, well, let's look at the verses. Why did God command the destruction of the horses? Look at this verse in 2 Kings chapter 23. I push you way forward in history with this. I'm going to show you something about horses and chariots. That's why I'm doing this. Horses and chariots. God is in 2 Kings chapter 23, there's a young boy. He was 8 years old when he became the king of Judah, and he was probably the best king Judah ever had. Anybody know his name? The 8-year-old who became king of Judah. His name was Josiah. Josiah. Josiah is in the process of cleansing Israel again because they have fallen so deeply into idolatry. Horses, chariots, idolatry. There you go. Listen to what it says in 2 Kings chapter 23. The king, this is the young king, he's 18 according to the verse by this time. The king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priests of the second order and the doorkeepers. So he's telling his Jews, bring out, now listen to where they're taking this stuff from. This is the depths that Israel would fall to because they didn't destroy the idolaters in the land of Canaan. This is hard to read. The king of Israel, the king of Judah, the southern kingdom of the land of Israel, the southern kingdom, the king Josiah of Judah commanded the priest, the high priest, to bring out of the temple of the Lord, the temple where God dwelt, to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal, for Asherah, these are false gods, and for all the host of heaven, these are the stars, the moon, the sun, the constellations, everything that men would worship in the sky. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley, and he carried their ashes to Bethel. In the temple, Israel had brought in all these idols, all these false god idols that they had built. They were in the temple. In the next verse, he's cleansing. This young man is realizing how upset God is with the people of Israel. You know why he didn't know it as a young man? Why only at age 18 he starts to figure out, hey, God's mad at us. Our God is upset. You know why that is? Because the law of Moses was lost. There was someone who found it. Can you imagine in America every Bible being lost for generations? And then one day somebody's great grandkid says, hey, what's this? Look what I found. That was the situation in Israel. They had lost. Certainly they weren't following it. They had lost the writings of Moses in the temple. They were so crowded out by their idols and their idolatrous garbage to all these false gods, they had lost the law. Astounding. And in the days of Josiah, the law was found. Someone did say, hey, what's this? And they read it in the presence of the king, and the king tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and said, we are in danger. Our God Yahweh is mad at Israel for what we're doing. And that's why we're reading these things in 2 Kings. This young, courageous boy said, enough. We have got to immediately get right with our God. And that's why he's doing these things. Remember, horses and chariots. Hold it. Stay with me. He did away with the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed. Who appointed idolatrous priests? The kings. The leaders of Judah. He did away with the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense in the high places in the cities of Judah. All these mountaintop high place altars that they had built for all their false gods in the areas surrounding Jerusalem. Also, those who burn incense to Baal, to the sun. Remember earlier, all the hosts of heaven. Here it names them in the next verse. To the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, and to all the host of heaven. He was getting rid of everything that was a false god idol. Get rid of all of that. We, Israel, worship Yahweh, the one true God, the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we have not been doing that, and we have to cleanse our land. Horses and chariots. Look what it says a couple of verses later. Josiah, the king, having read the law of Moses and understanding the terror that Israel was facing was for a reason, Josiah did away with the horses. Why? What's wrong with the horses? Why are you killing horses? It says right here, Josiah did away with the horses which the kings of Judah had given to the sun. They were sacrificing the animals to the sun god. The horses were part of pagan idolatry. The horses in Joshua chapter 11 were being used by these Canaanite pagans in worship of false gods, the god of the sun, who God had just shown defeat to when he held the sun still in the sky over Gibeon. God wants the horses destroyed. You will no longer worship in this land, worship the sun gods by sacrificing horses to them. And that's why God had Joshua hamstring the horses, which would eventually kill them, and burn the chariots. He did away with the horses which the kings of Judah had given to the sun at the entrance of the house of the Lord. Where were the kings of Judah sacrificing these animals? At God's temple. That would be, and this is a horrible example, but that would be like someone coming into this Bible church, this church, taking all our Bibles and burning them and getting up in this pulpit that has been protected for 45 years against idolatry and starting to preach that Jesus is not God. That's what was happening in Israel. They had turned over their worship center, the temple of God. They had turned it over to God, to non-God fearing people that were worshiping false gods. And Josiah, just like you, was ready to fight to the death to not let that happen. Right? That's right. So he did away with the horses, the entrance of the house of the Lord by the chamber of Nathan Melech, the official, which was in the precincts, and he burned the chariots of the sun with fire. So not only were they worshiping the horse, worshiping the false god and sacrificing these horses, somehow the chariots were also involved. So Josiah, knowing that this was part of idol worship, because that's what he's doing, he's ridding the land of idol worship, he burned the horses, he killed the horses and burned the chariots with fire. So that's why. One more reason, I got to find a place to close. One more reason that God would have demanded that Israel kill the horses and burn the chariots is so that they, Israel, couldn't rely on the strength of the horse and the strength of a chariot to win battles for them. Again, what did God send David out with? 5 little stones. Because the battle belongs to the Lord. Look what the psalmist says, King David knows in Psalm 20, he says, some boast in chariots and some in horses, but not Israel. We will boast in the name of Yahweh our God. You see? I'm not going to allow you to amass this army of horses and chariots thinking that it's your strength that will defend you. And David knows it best. We will boast in the name of the Lord, not in the horses and chariots. So yet another reason why he didn't let them keep these horses and their chariots. Let's read a few more verses. Verse 10, Joshua captures the cities. He's defeated the armies at the waters of Merom. He's defeated the men, but the women and the children all live in the cities. They didn't go out to war. So Joshua has to turn back and defeat the cities. Joshua turned back at that time and he captured Hazor. And he struck its king with the sword. Remember, its king was from verse 1. He's the king that started this. Yabin. He's the one that brought this coalition together. He's the coward that didn't go out with his army to battle. Joshua has to go back to the city to find this guy. And he kills him in his city. The kings led the armies in battle in those days, but not this guy. So he turned back, he captured the city Hazor, he struck its king with the sword, for Hazor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. It was the leader, and their king was the one who brought this coalition together. In verse 11 it says, they struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed. And he burned Hazor with fire. And verse 11 says an interesting thing. Joshua captured all the cities of these kings. Not every city in the land, but all the cities of these kings. Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings. He struck them with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Good luck on your test. Look what it says. Moses, he says, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded in Deuteronomy chapter 7. This is when Moses commanded it. Moses tells Joshua, when the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and he clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations which are greater and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. So Moses had told Joshua, kill everything that breathes. Because God had told Moses, kill everything that breathes. No covenant, no deal, no favor. God has decreed that it's time for them to go and kill everything that breathes. In verse 13, we'll stop at this verse. It says, however, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except for Hazor alone, which Joshua burned. Now, the word mounds here is the word tel, T-E-L in Hebrew, tel. And a mound is a heap. Look at this city. We went here. This is my picture, and Amy and I were in this amphitheater here. This is the city of Beit Shan. I wish I could show you the map again, but it's a northern city. It's the city of Beit Shan. Can you see what's in the background? Can you see that hill back there, this mound? The Hebrews call this a tel. They've actually named one of their cities in commemoration of this word tel. They've named one of their cities with this word in it. What's the name of that city? Their capital city. Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv. A tel is this mound. And what this mound represents is generations after generations of cities. I don't remember the number, but I think it was like 12. That on this particular mound, 12 different cities have been built. On the ruins of the last city, they level it out and build a new city. When that one's destroyed in 100 years, they level it out the next 5 generations later, and they'll build another city. And all over Israel, you see these tels, these mounds of cities that were built up and built up and built up and built up. It was just the best land, maybe the best defensive position. But for whatever reason, whenever there were these tales, Joshua didn't burn those. Maybe for historical significance. If Joshua would have burned it, we wouldn't have ruins on the top of it now. It would have been done for. But we were there 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and that's what it still looks like. So these mounds like Tel Aviv is not one of these. It's named in commemoration of this ancient Israeli practice of building city on top of city, on top of city, on top of city. And you get these things that are like 100 feet tall, just decades and decades and centuries of people having been civilized there. Beit Shan, one more picture of Beit Shan. So you see the new city of Beit Shan built at its feet, and they left the ancient behind it. Very interesting. A lot of places like that in Israel. Okay, a lot to chew on. Let's close in prayer. Father,